you going to teach us anything?
What, you want me to teach you something? You want to learn something? All right. You got it!
Hello there and welcome back to Atomi Brainwaves. I'm your host Simon and I'm joined today by Sue. What's up, Sue?
Nothing.
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 Nothing at all. Well, glad to hear it. All the more room for conversation.
Yep.
We are recording here in the studio at Atomi HQ. Atomi is an online resource for second level education, a platform used by students and teachers alike to help make education awesome and engaging. We provide content for schools and students in Australia and the UK in the form of short, digestible, syllabus-specific videos and classroom activities. Unsurprisingly then, this is a podcast about education for educators, where we take a look at some key issues in the world of education. Today we're doing so with the help of our resident teaching expert, former head of English, digital learning leader for curriculum and pedagogy and director of curriculum, Sue. Today we're going to be having a look at visible learning. Slightly weird concept for a podcast when you're listening. It's visible learning. Anyway, that terrible joke aside, visible learning was a concept popularized by John Hattie in his 2008 book, Visible Learning, a synthesis of over 800 meta-analyses relating to achievement. The simple definition that he offers off the top is that visible learning occurs when teachers, by seeing through the eyes of their students, enable the students to become their own teachers. I want to start by unpacking that definition because I feel like there's a lot to be said in there. So let's break it up into two parts. First of all, Sue, can you walk us through what Hattie means by seeing through the eyes of their students?
Yeah, sure. I think, students are expected to navigate through a lot in their day and trying to see their learning or their experience through their eyes is pretty important and pretty difficult to do, really, because it's very hard as an adult to, I think, put yourself into the shoes of, whatever age, K to 12 student. So being able to, do that and see through the eyes of your student helps teachers to see what is working for them, see what is hindering them in their learning, and therefore be able to, adjust their teaching practice in order to do more of the things that help and less of the things that hinder.
Okay, awesome. And I guess the second part of the definition there, which we can also dive into, enable the students to become their own teachers. What exactly does he mean by this?
Well, I think putting students in a context where they can know what works for them and aid the way in which they learn is what he means by that. So a student, you can sometimes see quite precocious, articulate kids who are able to say, I learn in this way, or this way of learning works best for me. And that doesn't mean that they're always going to be able to learn in that way because, a good teacher is going to cater for a range of learning styles and types. But for a student to know that this is what particularly works for them, when they've got a task or they're trying to attack something, they know that I could break it down and do it in this way because that helps me to learn. And that's what he sort of is getting at there, that, they are essentially, they're not teaching themselves everything, but they're helping themselves to gain the knowledge in the way that works for them.
Yeah, that idea of enabling, I guess. Yeah. So the first part almost follows into the second within that definition, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
Okay. And I guess kind of intuitively following on from that is, I think it would be fair to say, a central pillar of the visible learning philosophy is the notion of feedback. And feedback going in both directions, from teacher to student and student to teacher. So I guess let's dive into what that feedback loop looks like and see if we can expand upon exactly how that might manifest itself in a classroom.
Yeah, this one can be quite daunting for teachers, particularly if you're sort of not at ease with a 12-year-old student reviewing your performance. But essentially for me, this starts in sort of conversational terms and then grows students' ability to be able to communicate with their teachers in a more mature fashion as to what it is that their teacher did that helped them to learn something. So, for example, when a student's clearly understood a topic, it's a golden opportunity for a teacher to quiz them on what it was that they liked about what the teacher did. How did it enable them to get it? So the student might say, well, it was the way that you explained it on the board, or they might say it was the way that you did the matching exercise with the terminology, But whatever they tell you, you can then essentially do more of that for that student because you know that helped them to gain the concept. I often do sort of end of topic reviews, which consist of the students demonstrating their understanding of the topic, as well as slipping in a few questions around my teaching practice. Like, it's just stuff on a like-art scale, and then invite some comment, which can be very interesting. But the sort of feedback that you get can help you to sort of tweak things. So you might get sort of ideas on exercises that you thought they would really like, but they actually hated. Or vice versa, things that you thought they would hate, it actually seemed really helpful for them. So gaining, like, just, I guess, being brave enough to kind of get some feedback on what it is that you're doing that works for A, the student, and B, the whole class, brings that feedback loop. So it's not necessarily just, well, Hattie's, in terms of Hattie's sort of visible learning, the most powerful use of feedback is for the teacher, not actually for the student. So that's a kind of distinction between what he found most powerful. So you're giving feedback to the students, but they're also giving feedback to you, and that's where the loop kind of occurs. Where
it has the most value.
Yeah.
Going back towards the teacher. So I suppose something you touched on there is, you talked about how it might seem quite daunting to teachers, and I guess that wraps around the critique of opening up these avenues to students. Certain people might feel that sacrifices a teacher's authority to a certain degree and kind of shifts the power dynamics in the classroom, and would maybe argue that it gives too much power to students. Would you agree with this, or would you say that it's maybe at the discretion of the teacher, and where it's up to them to draw the lines in the correct place to ensure that risk is avoided?
Yeah, I think so. Like, teachers are there to teach, so you'd hope that anything that helps them to teach in a more effective way is welcomed. But I think it's the same with anything that you introduce into a class, whether it's school-wide or class-based. You've got to put parameters around it. So you've got to, like, say, for example, you've got students who suddenly start doing online chats, in a discussion forum, in an LMS, for example. You've got to put rules around that they can't, they can't behave in certain ways towards each other. It's not Facebook, it's not Instagram. You've got to establish how you expect them to behave and speak to each other online. So the same way if they give you feedback to a teacher, you have to model what is expected. What does feedback look like? And it's not, that lesson was crap. That's not productive feedback. So it is about setting it up in such a way that they can offer feedback respectfully, and offer things that are useful and valuable. I worked at a school when I first came to Australia in 2008 who one of the senior executives actually was in charge of doing whole school-wide reviews on teachers. And so he would review teachers from year 9 through to 12. So we didn't do it with 7 and 8, sort of felt like they weren't perhaps mature enough to give the correct sort of feedback. But through year 9, 10, 11, 12, every class was surveyed on all of their teachers and how they, I guess, responded to them, not how they felt about them, because that feel brings
open up
like, don't like, but how do they respond to their teaching? And so the questions were cleverly worded. And this was back in the day, this is 2008 to 2012 when we did these. So it wasn't really like a Google form for it or something like that was like Gilbert collated them all by himself, one by one kind of thing, and then gave them to the teachers. Actually, he gave them to the heads of department, and then we gave them to the teachers in a kind of summarised, useful version sort of thing to help their teaching. But the heads of department got the very raw feedback. And it was very useful to every teacher that I went through as part of their performance management for them to actually see what was working. So they had more comments anonymised because that was sort of school-wide. But they did get things like, I really enjoyed this unit because we did it in this way. And so realise what was working for their audience in that time.
Yeah, and I guess it's such a key there what you touched on, this idea of the questions and how they're worded makes such a huge difference because, of course, it is the students' feedback, it's their thoughts, but it's if you can phrase something in the right way, if you can lay out very clearly, this is what I want you to tell me about, you both get a lot of value and you also sidestep potential problems.
Yeah, it's not ratemyteachers.com.
Yes.
It is.
Wonderful website.
Yes. Don't ever look yourself up. but it is designed to help with certain things. So it's not free rein. It is feedback to improve our teaching. And when it's sort of cushioned around that, and that's important.
Yeah, and I guess one thing that springs to mind that might be said as a counterpoint to that argument that you sacrifice authority is that I'm just thinking of myself and putting myself back in my own school days. And I definitely felt that any teacher who was open to what I had to say and was actively seeking out my thoughts, I actually felt it had the opposite effect. It strengthened my respect in that teacher. And if you're in a classroom where you feel heard by the teacher, if you feel they actually care about what I think, it can, not only does it help them get better by taking on board my feedback, but it motivates me to work harder in that classroom. Would you agree? Do you think that? Yeah,
definitely. I think the more that teachers show their humanity, the better. Because when you're actually showing a sense of, I'm a person too, and I've often described weaknesses too. Say for example, you really expected that you were going to get all that marking done that weekend, and you just didn't because a terrible, illness struck your house or whatever. It's fine to actually be real with students and say, I'm sorry I've let you down in this way, and this is why. And then that, like you say, that kind of level of respect of relationship deepens because you're actually sharing life together.
When openness and honesty.
Yeah. Like sometimes with students, you might actually be teaching them 7, year 8, year 9. You're doing life together, in some aspects.
It's true.
And so the more that you're building in that sort of sense of reality, and sometimes they might miss a deadline and you might miss a deadline, or but if you respect them and you respect their thoughts and their that includes respecting their thoughts on you, it's much better for everybody all around.
It has that kind of extra effect of strengthening the relationship beyond just strengthening your own effectiveness as a teacher. So I guess so far we've kept our focus on the sort of micro level, if you will, of visible learning in a classroom. But just to kind of bring it out broader on this sort of macro scale, I mean, statistical evidence obviously played a huge part in the building of this philosophy, I think it would be fair to say. Hattie himself, he based it off, I think it was 800 meta-analyses, and it played such a huge role in collating his thoughts. And I guess the question that leads me to is this idea of the role that statistical evidence should play within the classroom.
Yeah.
And there's sort of two sides to it, where you might say, well, of course we should lean heavily on the research, conduct as many studies as we can, and let that inform how a teacher teaches his or her classroom. The other side of that is a teacher might say, no, I know what works for me. I know how to teach, and it's just trying to put a square peg in a round hole if I'm trying to bring in this technique that a book told me to do. So I guess, where do you think the truth lies? To what extent should statistics inform a classroom and how a teacher teaches versus that teacher's own experience?
Yeah, I think statistics do have a big part to play in education, and to ignore what is, huge longitudinal data seems sort of counterproductive, But I don't think it's a question of letting that dictate, because it is very real that teachers are expert curators. They have a huge job to do every 50 minutes or so of a day in front of 20 to 30 kids, and they do know what works. So, yes, it's a kind of putting your experience, your day-to-day, I'm in the thick of it experience against what you have read and learned, and the latest kind of theories on education, and sort of mashing it together. Teachers need to still be very much in tune with what is going on and how people learn, and obviously that evolves, and we learn more things and new things about how people learn. So for teachers not to be learners is a weird thing for me.
Yeah, it doesn't quite make sense.
Yeah, it doesn't quite make sense. So I think you've got to give teachers the respect that they deserve. Every lesson has got different personalities, different abilities. Every day brings challenges, from what happened over the weekend to what the weather's doing. It's just ridiculous how the weather can influence a lesson. But all of that is happening in front of you, and then they've got all of that on the ground knowledge plus their theoretical knowledge in their heads in front of what is a fairly unforgiving audience, sort of repeatedly throughout the working week. They're making on-the-spot judgment calls, and they kind of just get it, like they know what works. But I think with sort of applying, I guess, research-based, evidence-based learning onto knowing what works, you've also got to kind of take a step back and say, well, you know, this is how I behave often in the classroom. These are some ways that I have read about or that are particular at the moment that are be improved to help learning. How can I incorporate that with what I know? And that's the kind of mashing it together, I guess. And then through that, you've become a better teacher, you know. And so sort of there's many iterations, I think, of a teacher as they go through their career, you know, a bit like Madonna. Just keep reinventing yourself kind of thing.
The perfect avatar for any teacher.
Yes.
Madonna.
Not the 80s one.
Yes. Well, like you said, many stages.
Yeah,
many
exactly.
Stages.
But like someone who, you know, you've got, I guess, the core of yourself as the teacher. You've got, you change and you grow with experience, but you've also got new learning that comes to the forefront. And it'd be like, you know, a doctor saying, oh, we're not using that drug because that wasn't around when I learned, you know, like you've got to keep up. Yeah, you've got to keep up with what's working and what's new and what's evidence-based. But you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater either.
Yeah, I guess the impression I'm getting is it seems to be about having the nous to know when what works, when it's to stick to the model, and other moments when you say, okay, a different kind of touch is required here. And I guess that does come with experience, doesn't it? Yeah,
and I think that's why it's such an exhausting job. Like, it's such a rewarding job, but it is exhausting. You know, if you've ever had a 6-period day, you know, or double year 8 on a Friday afternoon, for example, that takes a lot to get learning happening in the classroom in some of those situations. So, and you are making split-second decisions for all of the time that you're teaching. Things change quite rapidly, you know, and you've got no control over, say, so-and-so split up with so-and-so, or there was a fight at lunchtime, or anything like that, and how that affects the lesson, the brilliant lesson that you've planned, you know, totally derailed by a kid crying in the toilets. You know, you've got so many different circumstances, and that's where teachers are experts at their trade, you know.
Okay. Well, even though we have shown now that a brilliantly planned lesson can be totally derailed, let's still try and talk about brilliant planning of a lesson. And I guess, you know, what I want to ask is how an individual teacher might take some strategies from the visible learning model and put them into practice in their classroom. If you have any examples, you can run us through.
Yeah, so I'll just recap the basic premise of Hattie's research. He analysed the effect of different aspects of teaching, learning and assessment and out-of-school factors into effect sizes. Anything with an effect size of plus 40, I think it was, showed to have a reasonable impact on student learning. So the ones that I want to focus on today are collective teacher efficacy, which has plus 1.57 effect, teacher clarity at plus 0.75, direct instruction at 0.6, response to intervention at 0.75, and scaffolding at 0.82. So all above that zone of 40 efficacy, in terms of efficacy. So collective teacher efficacy in practice, to me, just means using your colleagues as resources for each other. And this is something that I strongly advocate. I hate reinventing the wheel. I hate sort of like internal competition between teachers where they don't share resources, they don't sort of team teach or play to each other's strengths. That kind of is not helping each other to build that sense of collective teacher efficacy. Like, we're all in it together and we're here for the sole purpose of helping our students to be the best that they can be. So why not do it together? So, for example, avoid things like internal competition. You know, like it's really great if your kids get the best in the HSC, but everybody's kids doing well will help everybody's kids to do well, you know. So, I think avoiding things like that are really important, and making sure that everybody is helping each other, I guess. Teacher clarity, I think, is really important. So when a teacher can explain a concept in a way that students really understand, and that helps them to learn. So for that one, things like strategies like avoid talking too much from the front of the classroom. Don't waffle, be succinct, be clear. Things like our product Atomi can really assist in this because our videos have the benefits of students being able to pause and think over, rewind if need be, and all that sort of helps to really grasp the clarity of what is being explained to you, which can get lost in a teacher explanation if it's sort of waffling on a little bit too much. That also links with your direct instruction as well, but reusable content is very good there as well. In terms of scaffolding, I think what's often missed in classrooms is showing students what they need to do to succeed. So like when you hand out an assessment task, show them how to succeed by showing them, I guess, what they're aiming at. It doesn't have to be exactly like that, but show them what is a good example, model how to do a task and scaffold their responses so that they can step through what is required of them. Students respond really well to timed intervention, so keep an eye out for when you need to intervene in their learning and just, I guess, make sure that you are giving them full examples of what you need to do. And that response to intervention at that sort of 0.75 score, responding regularly when you feel that they're going off track will help. So the structure and the scaffolding and response to intervention, I think, go really nicely hand in hand together.
Yeah, amazing. Some really, really effective sounding strategies there in relation to visible learning and to bring into your classroom. The last thing I want to ask you about is not strictly in relation to visible learning, but almost is more in relation to its creators. Hattie and others who are strongly behind the practice have claimed that educational policy oftentimes ignores the data that they or other researchers are presenting and in favor of educational policy reform that I guess has a basis more in opinion than it does on the statistical research. I was wondering, do you think this is the case? And if so, why? And what can be done to correct this?
Yeah.
It's a big question, I know.
It's a big question. I think educational reform is a little bit like health reform. It can take 20 to 30 years before findings are really sort of embedded and implemented. I sometimes think it's a bit like the politicians didn't come up with the idea themselves, and so they have to think of something different rather than go with the researchers and those key facts as they stand. But that's just my own view. I guess in many ways we've come quite a way in education, but I think for me one of the hardest things is that there's so much noise around the space, and that there's so many kind of educational reforms. It's hard to hold on to one in a real tangible form. I find Australia interesting coming from the UK, where we had a national curriculum. So there was a statewide education, and it was sort of more simple. We had GCSE and A-level. They were the qualifications, and everybody, wherever you travelled around the country, was doing the same thing. But with Australia, with every state holding onto their own version of the curriculum and the assessment, I think it makes it really hard to drive reform because it's like we're united but not, So then you get lots of differences in how one state is behaving to another, and it's very hard to, look at when the national curriculum was launched. That was supposed to kind of unify Australia, and instead it got merged into Nessa syllabi. It's like a nod to it now rather than, because some states believe their system is better than the other state, so they don't want to kind of give an inch. Almost
like what you were talking about with the politicians in a way, but on a broader scale between states.
Yeah. So I don't know whether that answers the question, other than I think it's incredibly complex, and I think it's almost more complex here because of the individual states' ownership, and I guess some of those states not wanting to give an inch in terms of that ownership.
Look, it's a big question. We don't need to solve the problems of the world.
Not today.
I'm sure it'll come up again and again
as
we record more and more episodes, so we'll revisit. I guess that's all we have time for so far in relation to visible learning. Before we go, we're going to have, as always, Sue's hot tip, a little piece of advice or story from your years in teaching. For teachers out there, can be serious, can be jokey. It doesn't even have to be about teaching at all. So give us your hot tip for the day, Sue.
Well, this one is serious, but it's actually quite funny when you do it. Video yourself teaching. It's hilarious. And
Dream move for any teacher.
I've only done it once. And it's just so funny to it's like hearing yourself on an answer machine message or something. Like it's cringeworthy, but it's really valuable to see where you spend your time in the class, who you avoid, who you teach, who you where you walk, where your kind of safe spot is, like, just the dynamics of you in the classroom. If you can't do it, if you can't set yourself up, get a friend to do it for you, and then make sure you video them so that they haven't got enough dirt on you. But it's just really interesting exercise, and it will give you the feedback that you kind of need, that we just talked about at the beginning, that you can get from students, but you can also get it from doing this for yourself, replaying it. Self-evaluation, absolutely.
Okay. Well, can't imagine it'll be the funnest thing any teacher will have to do, but it's a good piece of advice.
Yeah.
We should say, so long as you have, permission to video if there are students in the room.
Yeah, well, if you're only using it, if you're just using it internally for yourself, it should be fine. But don't go and put it on YouTube.
Yes, just thought we'd cover ourselves very quickly there. Sound piece of advice, so long as all the necessary boxes are ticked and I's are dotted and T's are crossed. Alrighty, well, thank you very much, Sue. That's all we've got time for today. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Looking forward to having you back for wherever we end up in the world of education next. In the meantime, check us out on our main site at getatomy.com. For now, it's goodbye from Sue.
Bye.
And goodbye from me. Bye-bye.